Somewhere in the Yukon, under a sky that barely gets dark in summer, a fleet of excavators and wash plants grinds through frozen gravel, chasing flecks of gold that have been sitting in that ground since before anyone thought to look for them. At the center of it is a man who was running heavy equipment before he could legally drive a car. Parker Schnabel didn't inherit a fortune. He inherited a shovel, a grandfather's stubbornness, and a piece of land that taught him everything the hard way. Today, he's one of the most recognizable names in reality television and one of the wealthiest young figures come out of it. Not because he plays a character, but because the risks he takes on camera are the same risks that could genuinely end his business. This is a story of how a kid from a town of 1,700 people turned dirt into millions, and what his life actually looks like once the cameras stop rolling. Haines, Alaska isn't the kind of place that produces many household names. It's small, remote, and surrounded by wilderness that doesn't care how prepared you are for winter. Parker Russell Schnabel was born there in 1994, into a family that had already staked its identity on gold. His grandfather, John Schnabel, ran the Big Nugget Mine, a real working operation, not a hobby claim. By the time most kids are learning to ride a bike without training wheels, Parker was already sitting in the cab of heavy machinery, his feet barely reaching the pedals, learning to move rock and gravel under his grandfather's watch. That kind of upbringing does something to a person. There's no faking competence around machinery that can crush a truck if you're careless with it. Parker grew up understanding tonnage, wash plants, and recovery rates the way other kids understood homework. He played basketball at Haines High School and, by his own account, seriously considered studying geology or mining engineering. But the pull of the family operation was stronger than any classroom. And when his grandfather's health began to decline, the decision that would define Parker's adult life started taking shape long before he was legally an adult. John Schnabel passed away in 2016, and with him one of the last living links to the old-school era of Yukon and Alaska mining. Parker was still a teenager, and suddenly the full weight of Big Nugget Mine's future rested on him. He had already been shadowing operations for years, but shadowing and owning are two very different things. Rather than take the conventional path, college, a degree, maybe a mining career built slowly through a company ladder, Parker made a decision that still gets talked about in mining circles. He took the money that had been set aside for his education and put it directly into equipment and ground. It wasn't a small, symbolic gesture. It was his entire safety net, converted into loaders, wash plants, and a lease on land in the Klondike. There was no guarantee it would work. Placer gold mining is brutal, seasonal, and unforgiving. A bad thaw, a broken pump, or ground that simply doesn't hold what you hoped it can wipe out a season's investment in days. It worked. Not instantly and not without scars, but it worked. Within a few years, Parker had transformed a risky, all-in bet into a mining operation that was pulling real, television-worthy quantities of gold out of ground. And by his mid-20s, industry estimates put his lifetime gold production well into the tens of millions of dollars. When Parker first appeared on Discovery's Gold Rush, he was a teenager nobody outside of Haines had heard of. The show had built its early seasons around older, more established miners, and a kid barely out of high school leading a crew didn't look, on paper, like a formula for compelling television. That changed the moment cameras actually caught him working. He didn't need a script to explain wash plant efficiency or ground conditions. He'd been living it since childhood, and it showed. Over the years that followed, Parker became one of the show's central figures, and his on-screen presence tracked almost exactly with his real-world growth as a miner. He wasn't just running Big Nugget Mine anymore. In his late teens, he used what remained of his resources to lease ground in the Klondike from veteran miner Tony Beats, striking out as an independent operator years before most people his age have settled on a career. That arrangement came with real friction, the kind of generational tension between an established old hand and an ambitious newcomer that made for some of the show's most talked about moments, but also gave Parker ground and the credibility to build something of his own. By his mid-20s, he wasn't just a cast member anymore. He was arguably the face of the franchise, and one of the few people on the show whose business decisions carried real, non-fictional financial consequences. If there's one decision that defines Parker Schnabel's approach to risk, it's Dominion Creek. In 2023, at 28 years old, Parker put down roughly $15 million to acquire the historic claim, a stretch of ground in the Klondike Gold District that had been worked on and off since the late 1890s. The appeal was obvious. Estimates suggested the ground could hold somewhere around 80,000 ounces of gold, worth well over $160 million at the time. The catch was just as significant. Much of that gold sat roughly 40 feet underground, buried under decades of overburden that earlier generations of miners had never bothered to dig through because it wasn't economical for them to try. Parker went for it anyway. It was, by his own public description, a long-term bet rather than a quick payoff, and he was upfront that it would take years before anyone, including him, would know if the numbers actually worked out. Early results were rough. Frozen, difficult ground slowed his crews down. Equipment failures ate into already thin margins, and for a stretch of time it looked like the kind of decision that could just as easily be remembered as a cautionary tale as a triumph. What makes the Dominion Creek story worth telling isn't just the size of the number. It's what it reveals about how Parker actually operates. He didn't buy the claim because it was a safe, guaranteed return. He bought it because he believed the geology, trusted his crew's ability to execute, and was willing to accept years of uncertainty for a shot at something much bigger than another ordinary season. That's a very different kind of wealth building than the image most people have of a young reality TV star cashing checks. It's closer to how a commodities trader or a wildcat oil driller thinks. Most of the money is still in the ground, and getting it out is a bet, not a guarantee. Public estimates of Parker Schnabel's net worth vary quite a bit depending on the source and the year, generally landing somewhere in a range of $8 to $15 million. Built primarily from three streams. The gold his operations physically pull out of the ground each season, his earnings from discovery for Gold Rush and its spin-off Parker's Trail, and a smaller but growing slice from merchandise and brand partnerships tied to his name. None of those figures are audited public records. Mining income fluctuates heavily season to season, and reality TV salaries aren't typically disclosed in detail, so any specific number should be treated as an estimate rather than a fact carved in stone. What's more consistent across reporting is the way he's described spending it. Compared to a lot of people who reach this level of visibility this young, Parker's public image leans noticeably practical. Interviews and profile pieces repeatedly describe him reinvesting the bulk of what he earned straight back into the business. Better equipment, additional ground, water pumps, wash plants, the unglamorous infrastructure that actually determines whether next season is profitable. It's not the instinct of someone chasing a lifestyle brand. It's the instinct of someone who watched a family mining operation nearly stall out and understood early that gold mining eats capital constantly, whether or not the cameras are rolling. That doesn't mean there's no personal spending at all. He owns work-capable vehicles suited to the terrain he operates in, and by multiple accounts maintains property connected to his operations in both Alaska and the Yukon, which makes sense for someone who effectively lives at his job sites for large stretches of the year. But the picture that keeps showing up season after season isn't one of yachts and red carpets. It's someone who treats a mining claim the way other wealthy young people might treat a stock portfolio, as a thing that actually matters, with everything else being secondary. No honest account of Parker's career on Gold Rush can skip over his relationship with Tony Beats. When Parker was still a teenager looking for ground to mine independently, Tony was already an established, respected figure in the Klondike, and the arrangement they struck, Parker leasing land from Tony under a royalty structure, became one of the more layered relationships the show has ever captured. It started as something close to mentorship. Tony had the ground, the experience, and the standing that Parker, at that age, simply didn't have yet. As Parker's operation grew more sophisticated and more successful, the dynamic between them shifted. What began as an older miner giving a promising kid a chance gradually took on the tone of two serious competitors operating in the same small world, each pushing the other to sharpen their game. The show captured plenty of friction along the way. Disagreements over ground, over strategy, over how royalty terms should apply as Parker's production scaled up. Whatever the exact temperature of their relationship behind the scenes, in public commentary over the years, both men have acknowledged in their own ways the other's skill. It's the kind of rivalry that made for genuinely compelling television precisely because neither side it was manufactured, the ground, the gold, and the money at stake were all real. Another relationship that shaped the show's early identity was Parker's dynamic with fellow miner Todd Hoffman. The two represented, in a lot of ways, two different eras and philosophies of mining. Todd came from a more traditional, experience-first mindset, while Parker's rapid rise represented something newer and, to some longtime viewers, more disruptive. Their operations were frequently compared directly against each other in terms of gold production. And as Parker's numbers climbed season after season, the contrast became harder to ignore. Todd eventually stepped away from the main Gold Rush series, going on to lead his own spin-off with his family. The reasons behind that transition, as he's discussed in interviews since, involved a mix of business pressures and the toll that years of high-stakes reality television had taken. Whatever the full picture behind the scenes, the two men's parallel arcs on the show, one ascending rapidly, the other stepping back to regroup, became one of the more human through lines of the franchise's history. For all his success, Parker's run hasn't been a smooth, uninterrupted climb. Placer mining is inherently volatile, and seasons that look triumphant in a highlight reel often involved real financial strain behind the scenes. Equipment failures, permitting delays, and ground that simply doesn't produce what the geology suggested it should are constant risks in this line of work, and Parker's operation has run into all three at various points, particularly during the demanding early years to try and make Dominion Creek pay for itself. What tends to separate his story from a cautionary tale is what happens after those setbacks. Rather than walking away from a struggling claim, his public statement about Dominion Creek have consistently framed it as a long game, an investment he expects to take years to prove out, not a bet he expected to pay off immediately. That kind of patience is unusual in an industry and on a television show built around the promise of a big, dramatic gold strike by the season finale. In more recent years, Parker's ambitions have started reaching well past the ground his grandfather once worked. Gold Rush. Parker's trail sent him chasing gold mining knowledge and opportunities across the globe, through the outback of Australia, the dense interior of Papua New Guinea, and eventually towards some of the legendary gold regions of South America, including visits tied to the storied history of Serra Pelada in Brazil. These trips weren't just travelogue filler. For someone whose entire business is built on understanding ground, equipment, and recovery techniques, exposure to different mining traditions and geological conditions around the world functions as genuine professional development, the kind that can inform how he approaches future ground back home. That international curiosity fits the broader pattern of how Parker seems to think about his own career. He's not simply defending the same claims his grandfather worked decades ago. He's treating gold mining as a global craft worth studying wherever it's practiced, which suggests an ambition that extends well past staying the most successful miner on a reality show. Strip away the show's editing and the internet's tendency to round every number up, and what's left is a fairly consistent picture. Parker Schnabel became wealthy the same way his grandfather tried to teach him to mine, by understanding the ground better than the next person, being willing to lose money before making it, and reinvesting almost everything he earned straight back into the operation rather than into the trappings people usually associate with sudden young wealth. That's part of what makes his story compelling beyond the gold totals themselves. He didn't become financially successful through a viral moment or a single lucky break. He built it season after season, claim after claim, often making decisions, like walking away from a college fund at 18, or committing $15 million to ground that might not pay off for years, that could just as easily have ended in failure. The fact that they didn't isn't luck. It's the result of someone who spent his childhood learning that the ground doesn't care how confident you are, only whether you actually know what you're doing. Whether Dominion Creek ultimately becomes a defining triumph of his career, or just one very expensive chapter in a much longer story, is still an open question, even to Parker himself, by his own admission. But that uncertainty is, in a strange way, the most honest thing about his lifestyle. Unlike a lot of wealth built on entertainment alone, his is still tied directly to something physical, seasonal, and genuinely uncertain: gravel, water, machinery, and gold that either shows up in the sluice box or doesn't. For someone who started operating heavy equipment before he could ride a bike, without training wheels, that's probably exactly the kind of life he set out to build.